Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Julie. And great being here. Really honored and really excited. I hope everyone's had a great summit so far. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, great. So just a quick introduction about me. Again, I'm Katharine. I'm co-founder and CEO of Wizform. Prior to Wizform, I was a software engineer at a fintech mortgage company called Blend here in San Francisco. I've also spent time as chief of staff of a nonprofit called #MovingForward, which is a nonprofit working to promote inclusive and equitable startup fundraising. So I've also worked a little bit as a scout and an investor for a microfund called Polymath Capital. Before I just jump into the journey, I just wanted to introduce Wizform a little, give you a picture about what we do. So we provide a transparent, affordable, and educational incorporation service for small businesses and startups alike. Our mission is to lower the barrier to starting a company so that anyone can start their business as quickly and easily as possible. So my co-founder and I both come from families of small business owners, and we really wanted a way to support our local communities and entrepreneurs all over the country. So quick timeline to give you an idea of our journey. I met Hardy back in September last year, and for the first 2 or 3 months, we were going through ideation, user research, prototyping. In January this year, we decided to officially incorporate, and we started building out our MVP, and then we ended up launching our V0 in April. So you can see it kind of took us about 4 months to build our MVP. Real quick, the agenda. The first thing I want to go over is just a case study on Wizform and our journey. And then after that, I'll kind of give more general frameworks and insights about specifically about being a non-technical founder. How do you build an MVP? And then how do you also hire engineers or contractors? All right, so the first phase in Wizform's journey was ideation. Like I said, we spent about 2 months ideating and iterating, and this was also when I was trying to kind of work with my co-founder. I didn't know him before. We both worked at Blend, but we never worked together, trying to find out our different working styles. So we had weekly meetings to discuss ideas we had, what to focus on, who to do user research with. And it was really great for us, especially being remote, just to have these weekly meetings and just to talk a lot. So about 1 month into ideating, we decided to create an initial prototype that we could show people, have them click through the flow without our help, and provide feedback that way. And even though I am an engineer, I didn't actually want to spend the time creating an actual app. So we actually used a tool called UXPin, and I'll kind of go over tools we used in a bit. UXPin is a powerful prototyping tool, and I was able to create this prototype in a day or two. Saved us a lot of time. You don't need to write code, and we used this prototype to test it out with potential users. And kind of at the end of these 2 months, we felt confident in the idea and the team, and that's when we decided to incorporate. So throughout this presentation, I wanted to emphasize the tools we used. I think it's pretty interesting to see what we started out with and what we ended up with and what we stuck with, and offer some tangible tools for you to use for your business. So in the beginning, honestly, we just started out with Apple Notes, pen and paper. I'm a huge fan of just whiteboarding and taking a letter-sized paper and writing on it. Really awesome to see, to visualize your flows and your diagrams. A really awesome tool is Figma. If you're not familiar with it, it's a design tool. It's collaborative. It's kind of like Google Docs. Multiple people can be working at the same time. You use it basically you can do a lot of things, but we mainly use it for wireframing, mockups, and also to do our high fidelity designs for our actual app. It's pretty much free. I think we're still on the free plan. And then outside of Figma, we used UXPin as our prototyping tool. So Figma has a simple prototyping tool, but it's not that powerful. For us, we had this form where based on what the user inputted, we wanted to show different pages. So we needed to do conditional logic. And Figma didn't support that, but UXPin did. It was awesome. I'd recommend using it. And then just a shout out to Google Suite. It's free, it's easy, you're familiar with it. We still use Drive, Docs, Sheets. Sheets is super awesome. Yeah, so I guess TLDR, like you don't really need the newest, fanciest productivity tool. Just try to utilize the free ones first. Some learnings during our initial phase. Again, use as many no-code solutions as possible in the beginning, even if you're technical, even if you have an engineer on the team. In the beginning, it's really important to iterate as fast as possible. And again, there's so many free tools out there right now that are really, really good. Subscriptions add up. They cost a lot of money. And we were bootstrapping for our first 6 months, so didn't have that much capital to spend on the newest tool. All right, so the next phase after user testing was the product and eng roadmap. So this phase kind of began in the beginning of this year. We had a general idea of what we wanted to do. We wanted to build some sort of incorporation service, but there's so many features we wanted to build. We kind of struggled with focusing on the most important features and narrowing down on scope. And that's something we're still struggling with and working on. It's probably going to be something we'll continuously be working on. And then since this is supposed to be more of a technical talk, I will focus a little more on the engineering perspective for this roadmap part. For me, even though I had done my own side projects at my previous company, I was the first engineer on one of their new product teams. So I also helped build a feature from scratch. It's just really not the same when you're starting something by yourself or with just one other person. And it's really important to realize and know whether you're an engineer or whether you're working with an engineer. Starting something completely from scratch is really daunting, and there's just so many things you might not have considered. So I assume you would, or for us, we started out with our product roadmap, and then we went on to more of our eng roadmap. And I just wanted to note that even if you have your product roadmap pretty much spec'd out, you're pretty confident that you're focused enough, try to be flexible because once you start building, you'll kind of learn that there's probably too much scope still, and you probably need to narrow down a little. There's a lot to anticipate with an entire full-blown out app. There's a lot of infrastructure and DevOps work that might not have anything to do with your product roadmap, but it's really important and it has to get done. So learning how to estimate your time is a really important skill. Estimating how long it'll take for an engineer to build something and just giving a lot of buffer room for that. For us, how did this manifest? Well, we thought we could build our entire app in 2 months with just me as an engineer, which was clearly impossible. And we learned that very quickly within the first month. I had kind of, after the first month, we only had the infrastructure really built out, and I hadn't even started working on the main features. So we quickly, humbled ourselves, went back to the product roadmap, decided what features were really must-haves for our product launch. And then we also decided we needed more help, which I will kind of talk about in the next section. So at this point, we were using Google Sheets to keep track of all of our tasks in the beginning. At this point, there are just too many tasks and features to keep track of, so we decided to invest in Asana, which was honestly a little expensive for us at the time, but I don't regret using it. It's really useful to keep track of so many tasks and organize them in subtasks and in projects. We're still using Figma. We use Figma to this day, actually. And we actually canceled our UXPin membership because we didn't need to use it anymore. GitHub on the engineering side, really important. Back up your code, have version control. And then a little bit about our landing website. Our landing website, which is just wizform.com, that's something we did in the very beginning. And even though it's a simple website, we still didn't think it was worth it to spend the engineering time to build it from scratch. So I'd highly recommend you using a no-code service like Webflow or Squarespace to just build your initial website and get it out there. It's really key for building trust with their customers, for marketing, and for us also, your landing website, you're going to be changing it a lot, iterating on the copy, the graphics. So we also wanted a tool that my co-founder could also use, and he can just pop in, change some things, and it's super easy. So some learnings, and I mentioned these, give generous buffer room, learn how to chunk your day. One thing that's really important for engineers is having a large chunk of focus time. It takes a while to get into the flow when you're coding. So just keep that in mind when you're scheduling meetings with engineers. Just like 30-minute blocks of meetings are really detrimental to engineers' productivity. So I learned to kind of chunk out like the evening or the late afternoon, just have a block of like 3 hours where I didn't schedule any meetings. And then also identify the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves in both your tooling and your roadmap. All right, so we kind of had our foundation built out. Now we're really off to the races and trying to build out our V0 in time for our launch in April. In hindsight, we could have actually narrowed down even more, but I think one thing we did right was hiring. We ended up hiring a few contractors that worked from February to April. And the first thing we did was hire a designer to mock out our entire UI flow actually in 2 weeks. Pretty awesome turnaround time. At the same time, I was working on the backend code, the architecture design. And then after the designer, we ended up hiring 1 front-end developer and 2 back-end developers. So the front-end developer helped us build almost the entire front-end. Front-end is not really my strong suit, so I kind of just trusted him and let him take it. We had 1 back-end developer who was a little more senior, and he was helping us improve our infrastructure. That was really important because I trusted him to set it up correctly, and I knew I wouldn't have to spend more time fixing it later. And then I was working with the second backend developer to finish out our app. So I think throughout this process, it was really important to know what you're good at and what you need help with. It's really easy to just say, I'm going to do it myself. But at a certain point, you need to recognize what your weaknesses are and when you can lean on others. And of course, that depends on time, how much time you have, how much capital you have, your bandwidth. But I'm really, really glad we ended up hiring contractors to help us out. And we were able to push out our V0 in April. And then about a month after launch, we're doing pretty well. We decided we needed a full-time engineer, and that's great. So we actually hiring our first full-time engineer, and she just started and she's awesome. And it was actually really helpful to already have a built out product for her to take and build on top of and improve. So tools we used at this point, this is a little more technical, and depending on what the audience wants, I'm happy to dive more into the technical stack, but this is just a quick overview. So we're still using Asana, Figma, Github, Webflow. We're using Google Cloud Platform to host and deploy our backend services. We chose this over AWS because Google Cloud actually has a much friendlier UI. And for me, I'm not super familiar with infra. That was not my specialty before. A good UI was really important to me. Circle CI for continuous integration development. That just means every time you have a code change, you don't need to manually publish it yourself. We use Netlify to host and deploy our front-end services. The next bullet point is just our tech stack. So I can go more into that if people want. We ended up using Slack as we got more contractors and a larger team, and we needed channels for notifications and production alerts. And then we also got Zoom. Cool, so learnings from this phase, pick the tools that allow for easiest collaboration. I think this is especially important when you have a fully remote team like we did in the beginning. So that means, Figma, Google Docs is great, GitHub. Prioritize ruthlessly. So we actually decided to raise our pre-seed before launch. So the month before launch was a little crazy. I was trying to finish up the V0 product. We were raising our pre-seed, and we really needed to make sure we knew what we were doing, how to manage our time, and cut out things that were just nice to have. And then the third thing is just to lean on your support network for things you don't know. As a founder, especially if you're a solo founder, it can get really, really lonely sometimes, and there are a lot of things you don't know. I felt like, to be honest, I felt like I was a little overconfident when I started Wizform. I thought I knew everything. I really didn't. And I'm fortunate enough to have a great support network around me. And I called up my coworkers from Blend, and they helped me do a really quick 5-minute gut check on some engineering decision I was making. Or I had friends who would sit down with me for an hour or 2 hours and literally talk through my architecture design with me. And you'd be surprised with how many people are willing to help. So I just wanted to pause here to see if there are any questions before I dive into the rest. Julie, were there any questions that you saw? We can also just go on and then just have the Q&A.
Yeah, sorry, Dana White over here, just popping on live. Some really good questions I think we could address right now, which I think would be really helpful. So a couple questions around how did you find your contractors or developers? Like, where do you go? Like, I've known people mentioned Upwork, and perhaps you have your own network, but if you're looking for a developer, where do you go? And then what do you ask them?
Yeah, I actually dive into this in the next section, but just real quick.
Oh, great.
We used Upwork, we used LinkedIn. AngelList is great. There are kind of some nuances of if you want to hire a contractor versus an engineer. For contractors, I just recommend Upwork or LinkedIn. For more like an employee engineer, I'd recommend AngelList.
Great.
Yeah, and then interview questions is a great topic. That could honestly be its own session. It really depends on what your goals are. If you're just hiring a contractor to really help you get to the finish line and build out your app, you don't really need to ask many culture fit questions or behavioral questions even. Just vet out their technical skills. LeetCode is, I have some thoughts on LeetCode, but I think it's a good website just to, if you're non-technical, you can go there and kind of view some of the common technical interview questions you can ask an engineer. But if you're hiring for a full-time engineer, I'd put more emphasis on their culture fit versus their technical skills, because then you're kind of investing a year or 2 years into them and they can grow with you.
Amazing. Question that's a little specific, but since you built your product via a no-code tool, does your product have IP? And if so, how are you able to protect it? I'm using a no-code tool to build out my product, and any advice is appreciated.
That's a good question. So our app is actually not built from a no-code tool. We used Webflow to build just our landing website, but our actual app is not built with a no-code tool. It's built from scratch. I actually am not sure if I can answer this. I can get back to you after doing some research. I just don't want to give wrong information right now.
That's completely fair. There's another question maybe on the same thing that we might have to follow up on, but we'll throw it out there. And can you share tips on protecting IP security when outsourcing tech? For example, what access you should give or not give, root user access, etc.
Yeah, I can actually answer that. It's mostly in the contract. You make sure you write up a great contract. There are templates out there, but you should definitely read through the entire thing. All the IP protection should be in the contract you sign with them. For permissions, definitely do not make any contractor an admin or an owner of GitHub or any sort of deploy service. You should never ever set a permission for someone that's just like a catch-all, like they can do anything they want. Just go one step at a time. If they need one thing, give them permission for that thing. And then if they find that they need something else, give the permission for that thing. I think that will really protect you.
Great. Okay. Anything else you want to cover before you dive into the second part of this discussion?
I think
I'm just looking at the Q&A, going twice. All right, take us back on in.
Cool. All right, so this section, I just wanted to go over some general tips and frameworks. The first thing is, how do you build as a non-technical founder? And just setting the stage. So you have an idea, you've done some user research, you want to start building your MVP to maybe do some user testing, maybe a beta launch or a V0 product launch, and you're a non-technical founder, or maybe your team just doesn't have someone with an engineering background. So how do you build? I came up with some questions that I think would be useful for you as you start off thinking about how to build. So number one is just to identify the most important features and hypotheses you want to test. You can't do everything, but you can definitely focus on some features that will let you know if you have product market fit, etc. And then for each feature, ask yourself, what is the simplest form? So for us, our main app is essentially kind of like a TurboTask-esque flow. We give the user basically like a form, and then we take their user input and help them with incorporation. So for us, if our main product is a form, I'd ask myself, can I use Typeform? Can I use another form building tool? You'd be surprised, building a form from scratch is non-trivial. It's actually very complicated. So just ask yourself if there are any services out there that you can take full advantage of before trying to build it yourself. And a lot of them have 30-day trials, which is great. And then secondly, just ask yourself, what is your goal? Is it quick user testing or a quick demo you want to show investors? Is it actually for launch? And then an important question is, how many people are going to use it? If you're only going to have a dozen or a handful of people use it in the first couple of weeks, you probably don't need a full blown out app. If you're expecting, that's not, okay, sorry about that. If you're expecting, hundreds or thousands of users to sign up and use your product in the first month, you should probably look into tools and maybe a full blown out app to handle that volume. So if you decide to actually build out a full app, which can be a good solution in some cases if you're not doing just a no-code solution, there's a kind of 4 options I think you can look into. Number one is just finding a technical co-founder. So obviously the pros are all the pros that come with having a co-founder. I'm really glad I have one. Just having someone else to bounce ideas off of, someone who is as committed as you to making the company succeed. The cons are, they're hard to find. The fact is there are just more non-technical founders out there. So you might have to do some networking and do some searching. You're probably going to have to give up a lot of equity, anywhere from 15 to 50% of ownership of your company. I guess that could kind of go up and down based on if you want to provide them with salary. And then a level below that is finding a founding engineer. So they're probably going to be as committed as you are to helping the company succeed, but you can give them less equity. So you can give them around 1%. They'll be engineering focused, so they can just focus on growing the eng team and the culture. Cons are they're also a little hard to find, especially finding someone who fits your culture, and they're very expensive. Founding engineer is considered an employee at this point, so you need to provide them with employee benefits, a salary, things like that. For a technical co-founder, you might not need to provide them a salary. Contractors is what we decided to use in the beginning, at least. They are less expensive. You don't have to give them equity. It's a little more flexible in that you can hire a contractor for 2 weeks or 2 months. You can let them go. after a little bit, it's pretty flexible. The cons are kind of a toss-up on quality, and you should probably get good at interviewing and vetting out who is legit and can do what you want them to do. And I think an important thing is just it's a little bit stricter on scoping. You really need to know what you need and tell them that. And it's a little inflexible in that sense, where if you change the scope midway through their contract, it might take them longer, you might have to spend more money. And then the fourth option is just completely outsourcing your app to a third party. Caveat is I've never done this before. So just take this advice with a grain of salt. This is from what I've heard. It's going to be less expensive, probably the least expensive. They can kind of just build your app from end to end and give it to you. Cons that I've heard is, quality. You don't really have any control anymore over your app. They may be in a difficult time zone to work with, communication issues, and also if they deliver you a low quality app, you might just have to redo it again in a month or so, and that might not be worth it. So tools that I take advantage of if I were a non-technical founder: Figma, UXPin for design and prototyping for sure. For your actual app, I try to use Webflow, Bubble. If you're doing e-commerce, Squarespace, Shopify are great. Webflow and Bubble are very, very powerful. They have a lot of advanced tooling that we don't use, but I know a lot of companies who built their entire app with Webflow. Zapier, if you haven't used before, is great for integrations in a no-code way. So for example, if someone submits a form on your website, you can connect that form with Google Sheets. So all the form data is piped to Google Sheets using Zapier. And then you can also connect Google Sheets with Gmail, for example. So every time someone submits a form, you can email them some follow-up email automatically. And then an important point, the last bullet point is just about data. Obviously, you're going to need a database, but I think in the beginning, especially if you're not having hundreds or thousands of users, you can pretty much do with Google Sheets or Airtable as your database and keeping track of all your data. Once you get into an actual, Postgres or MongoDB, it gets really complicated and you have to deal with all the infra that comes with it. Quick tip. So I think I mentioned this before, but don't be afraid to ask for help or for a consultation. Even just, posting on Twitter, if you're active on Twitter, asking a question, there are tons of people who are willing to help or jump on a 20-minute call with you. You can reach out to me. I'd be happy to consult with you as well. Be very clear with what your goals are. Or on the side of just starting simple and taking it from there. I'd invest in just a really quick, simple app development course, or just even watching some YouTube videos. I think it'd be helpful to just know the terminology if you're working with contractors or engineers. And then just really, really make sure you have a good idea of your roadmap and scoping before you dive into building. The worst thing you want is you hire a contractor, you don't really know what you're doing or what features you want built, and then the contractor is just sitting idle while you figure out your stuff, and you're still paying the contractor. So you're kind of just wasting time and money then. And if you hire a contractor, they really need to know like exact scoping, the details of the features you want to build. Okay, so the last section I wanted to talk about is how to hire engineers. Setting the stage, you've decided you probably want to hire someone to help you out, or you don't have a technical co-founder yet. I think these are some important questions you need to answer to make a decision of what kind of engineer you want to hire. So what is my product roadmap for the next 3 months? How much capital do I have? How much bandwidth do I have? Interviewing, finding your funnel takes a long time. And then also, how technically challenging is my product? If it's a e-commerce like online shop, you could probably do it yourself with Squarespace or Shopify and just watch some YouTube videos. If it's going into, I don't know, blockchain or autonomous vehicles or something like that, I think you should really find a technical co-founder, because those things I don't think you can contract out. So 2 options for hiring. Contractor, great for, you know, finishing a certain part of your product, getting you to the finish line. You're going to spend less time, less money. I mentioned this when I answered that question, but for the interview process, just really focus on technical skills. If you already have a stack picked out, make sure they know the stack and they've worked in it. Make sure they have had side projects and other experience. Like you really don't want to have to onboard a contractor. You really need a contractor to just dive right in, build the thing, and you know, that's it. Communication skills, probably important, especially remote. And then if you're trying to hire a full-time engineer, that's kind of great if you have the capital and you want someone to be fully dedicated and help grow out the team and the company. It's definitely a lot more expensive with both money and time, because a full-time engineer is an employee you're going to be investing in for the next year, 2 years, 5 years down the line. You really want to make sure they're a culture fit and you won't need to fire them in 3 months. So I'd assume the interview process will take longer. You'll want to interview more people. For the interview process, I would just focus on talking to them as much as possible. Make sure they're a culture fit. Make sure you like working with them. They have the potential to grow and learn. They can mentor people and help build out the eng team. And ability to learn quickly is really important. And just, you know, being able to work more than 9 to 5, especially in the beginning. Of course, like this all depends on where you're at, like what seniority of engineer you want. For a senior engineer, you probably need to pay them more or just give them more equity, but there will be less onboarding and less mentoring you'll have to do on your part. Okay, so tools that we used to hire engineers. So for contractors, we used LinkedIn and Upwork. LinkedIn is fine, but you get a lot of resumes and applicants through LinkedIn, but it's a little hard to filter down on quality. So I think because of that, we ended up using Upwork a little more. It's a little easier to look at their past work to suss out who was actually experienced and committed, things like that. But yeah, we hired our contractors through Upwork and LinkedIn. I've seen lots of companies hire through Twitter. We haven't done that personally, but I've definitely seen success through Twitter. So you can kind of go into tech spaces and scroll and look at who is posting about wanting to find a job. You can just cold DM them. And I have a friend who hired, I think, all of their first 5 engineers through Twitter. For us, we used AngelList. So AngelList is really awesome because it's really startup focused. So you kind of know already that at the very beginning, everyone at AngelList is into startups and likes working at startups. For LinkedIn, it's kind of like the huge bucket of everyone. We actually hired our first full-time engineer through AngelList. We cold DM'd her on AngelList and it worked out. It was awesome. AngelList also has a program called A-List. We didn't use A-List. A-List is kind of a 2-sided marketplace where startups apply to be on this marketplace, and then engineers also apply to be on A-List. So that way you kind of get more quality candidates, more quality startups as well. Everyone's vetted out already, but it's a little more competitive. It's a little more expensive. Some tools we didn't use, but I've heard good things about is TripleByte, Toptal. We looked at Toptal briefly. It was actually a little too expensive for us. This was kind of before we raised our pre-seed. So I think they have a minimum salary band you have to provide the engineer. But I've heard great engineers and great quality from that. And then I don't think you need some fancy ATS tool like Lever or Greenhouse when you're hiring your first engineer or first employee. We just use Google Sheets to track candidates and have a rubric, and it was great. Okay, so quick tips. Don't be afraid to cold DM people. That's how we found our first engineer. Be really upfront about expectations and scope. And then really importantly, just when you're evaluating candidates, I'd always have a rubric that I use for every single candidate. And also for interview questions, I try to ask the same interview questions, whether it's behavioral questions or technical questions, to every single candidate, just to be consistent and in how you evaluate them. And it gets really tricky if you ask a senior engineer something, a junior engineer something, especially if you're not familiar with the technical side. Yeah, it gets really hard to evaluate candidates. And that's all I have. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter. My DMs are open. I think I'll also be in the expo booth for the next hour or so. So happy to talk to anyone one-on-one as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes. So you can go learn more about Wizform in the expo booth. Two quick questions that came up again and again, though, for you, which were, where do technical co-founders hang out? Like, where do you, where, like, are there certain, I know some places, but anywhere they hang out that we can start to find them and connect with them?
That's a good question. Where do we hang out? There's some communities that have popped up where I've seen just more technical co-founders hang out. So if you've heard of On Deck,
yep,
they're really large right now. I actually went through On Deck last year when I was trying to find a co-founder. If you navigate On Deck well, I think it's worth it. As in, you kind of know how to vet the people, because there are like thousands of people in On Deck now. So you'll get like hundreds of technical co-founders you can talk to, which is awesome. But it could also get kind of overwhelming. So like communities like On Deck, maybe your current workplace. I found my co-founder from my previous employer. I think Twitter. I've been more active on Twitter since starting Wizform, and also just throughout last year. A lot of engineers are actually on Twitter, and you can kind of network your way through. But unfortunately, I think it is still more referral based right now. But I think if you start meeting more engineers, they'll be able to introduce you to more other people.
Amazing. Well, Katharine, this has been super helpful. So really appreciate you walking us through your case study of how you've gotten to launch. And we're just so excited to see Wizform take off. So if you have other questions that we didn't address, please head over to the expo and Katharine will be hanging out there, or you can message her through the nice little arrow screen that looks like a send button at your top right screen. And you can connect with her on Twitter. So please go follow, like, and check out Wizform.